Hello and welcome to the first devlog for my beekeeping game. I started working on Project Nectar as I wanted to make a VR game with a wholesome vibe, and I felt that beekeeping would be a perfect fit. I'm making this devlog now as it's the start of the year, and I felt like it was a good time to show off the current progress of the project and get some early feedback. I've just about got a full game loop going, but currently it's really just a series of interactions and not quite a game just yet. Currently, the player can plant different flowers to produce different types of honey. They can also extract the honey from the frames, which they can then sell, and my favourite part so far is definitely the bees. In this video, I'll show you the current game loop and the bees in more detail, but first I'll walk you through the progress I've made to get to this point. I started out by making a honey super, which is the box the frames sit in. I modelled some frames in Blender and then imported them into Unity. I made it so you could lift them out of the super, and I wanted to make it feel like they were on some kind of rails, so I restricted the movement until the frame clears the top of the box. Then I added a way for the frames to produce honey over time. When the frames are full of honey, they become capped, which leads on to the de-waxing stage. I started off by getting the functionality of the slicer working in Unity. Then I made a shader to bend the wax away from the frame as the slicer progressed down. Once I had that working, I modelled a bucket in Blender for the frame to sit on, and then allowed the player to place the frame onto the bucket. When I updated to Unity 6, the shader I was using to bend the wax broke. However, I'd wanted to try a different approach to bending the wax anyway. So later on, I remade the bending functionality using blend shapes instead, which of course worked first time. After I fixed the bugs, I had it working with the new system. I much prefer this approach as it allows more control, and in the future I can update it to have bits break off and fall down. Next, I worked on the extractor. I also modelled this in Blender, making sure to keep some parts separate so you could rotate them in Unity. I then added functionality to add the frames to the extractor, along with a script that rotates the frames as you rotate the handle. Then finally, I added a latch that you could use to let the honey out. I also made some jars that you can fill with honey from the extractor. I followed a YouTube tutorial to make the fluid shader for it. By exposing some properties on the shader, I can update the colour and the amount the jar is filled in the editor or by code. So, now I had the start of the flow for extracting honey in a demo scene that I'd whipped up using some low poly assets. Next, I wanted to add a way to change the type of honey produced based on the plant. So, I made some seed packets, flower beds, and a watering can. Using some vector maths, I was able to only make the watering can pour water when you tilt it correctly. Now you can plant flowers which will affect the properties of the honey. Even though it's still an early prototype, one of the key goals for this game is to put the player into a space that feels nice to be in. For me, the current low poly environment assets didn't feel great, so I grabbed a nice looking asset pack called Pure Nature from the asset store. Frame rate is the #1 priority for VR, so the first thing I did was test that the headset could handle a scene containing these higher resolution objects. It runs a small scene just fine, but it does start to struggle with more assets. For now, this is okay. I just wanted to have a few nice visuals surrounding the main interactions. I've inspected the models and I know that I can optimize them using tools in Blender when I come to build a proper environment for the apiary. I didn't want to get too distracted with visuals at this point, so I turned my attention back to the game loop. I created some test recipes that define what flower traits are required for that type of honey. I then purchased some placeholder plant models for a few quid on the asset store and created some new flowers. Instead of a shop UI, I wanted to make a physical space for the player to actually go to purchase the items. So, I created the garden centre. You'll have to use your imagination a little bit until I model the environment, but the important thing is you can purchase items. So, now you can control the honey properties based on the flowers that you plant. I was able to change the colour of the honey when it matches a specific recipe, but I still need to work on a way to display its current trait properties to the player. Once that was done, I created a quick order system that's displayed in the workshop. The system will give the player a particular recipe to make. I started off with a note on the wall that potentially the player could grab and take with them to the shop, but I also wanted a more visual representation of the order, so above the collection crate you can see which recipes are required. As I cycle through the orders, you can see how the tiles update for each order. It needs some polish, but it works for now. Saving the best until last, I then added actual bees. A while ago I played around with a swarm system using Unity dots. I managed to create a swarm of bees using a Boyd style system. It was kind of cool, but also kind of terrifying, and not the look I was going for. I refined the behaviour to better resemble a bee swarm. It worked well, and I was pleased with what I'd made. However, I'm now using Unity 6 and the Dots API had changed a lot as it's had an official release. So I remade the system along with a new bee model. The original bee I made didn't quite fit the style I was going for, so I made a much friendlier model this time. As there's going to be lots of bees on screen at the same time, I tried to keep the poly count quite low for the bee model. Then as soon as I had the new bees in the game with the new swarm system, I put on the headset and it was absolutely amazing. It adds so much to the apiary environment, although if you have a phobia of bees, this probably isn't for you. There's so many cool things I'd love to add, like having the bees fly out of the hive when you remove the lid, having the bees crawl around on objects, or even having the bees avoid your hands when you wave them through the swarm. But for now, I'm focusing on the main game loop. So, now you've seen how the project has progressed, I'll quickly show you the flow of the main game loop. In the workshop, the player receives an order, and they can check which traits are required for that recipe using the recipe board. Once they know which traits they need, they can head on over to the garden centre and buy the flower seeds with the matching traits. Once they have the seeds they need, they can plant the flowers in the apiary. Once the flowers have been planted, the honey will start to be produced in the beehive. You can inspect the frames to see how they're doing. Once the frames are full of honey, you can place them in the trolley to transport them to the workshed. In the workshed, your frames will be piled up on the table, ready for you to dewax them. Once dewaxed, they can be placed into the extractor. As you spin the frames, the honey fills the extractor, ready for collection. Then you can grab a jar from the shelf and bottle up the honey. Finally, you can place the jar into the collection crate and sell it to get some money for your hard work. So that's the current game loop, and it shows where the project is currently at. The interactions are by no means finished. I know there's a lot that needs to be added to make them feel polished and fun to use. My next task is to work on allowing the player to manage how the honey is produced and control which traits it gains over time, along with a way to inspect the current traits of the honey. I also want to let the player buy and place their own flower beds to expand their planting capabilities. Eventually, I'd love to let the player paint their own flower beds, hives, and any other items in the world to really make it their own. In regards to the game, please let me know your thoughts. Is this something you'd want to play? Also, let me know if these devlogs are something you'd want to see more of, and if so, what would you like to see me cover? If you do want to see more, please subscribe to the channel. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.